The schedule email pinged into my inbox at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of closing out a customer account when I saw the notification pop up on my screen. The subject line read, "Updated schedule, effective Monday." My heart sank before I even opened it. I clicked the email and scanned the attachment. My hours, carefully planned for months around my life, my responsibilities, my daughter's school schedule, had been completely swapped without explanation. Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, the shift I had worked for 3 years straight, was gone. In its place, late nights and weekends. Tuesday through Saturday, 2 p.m. to 11 p.m. The message from my supervisor, a man named Preston Hall, was curt and final. "This is your new schedule. Adjust accordingly." No explanation. No prior discussion. No acknowledgement that this would append everything I had built my life around. I froze, staring at the screen, reading it twice to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. I wasn't. This was deliberate. This was meant to make me quit. I sat very still at my desk, my hands resting on the keyboard, my face carefully neutral. But inside, shock and anger were mixing into something sharp and cold. A colleague named Simone walked past my cubicle, glanced at my screen, and stopped. "You okay?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. I just kept staring at the email. Simone leaned closer, reading over my shoulder. Her expression shifted. "Oh no. He changed your hours." I nodded. She lowered her voice. "Beatrice, people are saying they want you gone. They've been lining someone up to replace you." I looked at her. "Who told you that?" "It's been whispered around for weeks. Preston's been talking to HR about restructuring." She hesitated. "I'm sorry." I thanked her and turned back to my screen. The pieces were falling into place now. This wasn't about scheduling needs. This was a setup. A quiet, calculated push to make me leave on my own so they wouldn't have to fire me and deal with the fallout. But they had made one mistake. They assumed I would fold. They assumed I was easy to push around. My name is Beatrice Thornton. I'm 41 years old, and I had been working as a customer service coordinator at Redstone Solutions for just over 3 years. I was good at my job. Consistent. Reliable. The kind of person who showed up on time, handled difficult clients without drama, and kept the operations running smoothly even when other people dropped the ball. And now, sitting at my desk with that email glowing on my screen, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just anger. Determination. I wasn't going to quit. I wasn't going to give Preston the satisfaction of watching me walk away quietly, making his plan easy and clean. I was going to do the opposite. I was going to show up. I was going to work those new hours flawlessly. And I was going to watch what happened when the replacement they had lined up, the person they thought would slot in seamlessly once I was gone, turned out to be exactly what I suspected they would be. Unprepared. Incompetent. And absent. To understand why Preston wanted me gone, you have to go back about 8 months. That was when I first started noticing the shift in how he treated me. For the first 2 years at Redstone, everything had been fine. My performance reviews were strong. My metrics were solid. I handled the most difficult client accounts because I had the experience and the patience to navigate complex issues without escalating them. Preston had always been professional with me. Distant but fair. But then, about 8 months ago, something changed. A new manager joined the leadership team, a woman named Cora Sims who had worked with Preston at his previous company. They were friendly. Too friendly. The kind of friendly that came with inside jokes, shared lunches, and a dynamic that made it clear Preston valued her opinions over anyone else's. And Cora had brought someone with her. A young man named Kyle Brennan, fresh out of college, eager and charming in that way that made people overlook his lack of actual experience. Preston started favoring Kyle almost immediately. The favoritism was subtle at first. Small things I noticed but didn't think much of at the time. In team meetings, Preston would ask Kyle for input on issues he used to ask me about. He would praise Kyle's fresh perspective on problems I had been solving for years without recognition. When I offered suggestions, Preston would nod politely and move on. When Kyle offered the same suggestions 10 minutes later, Preston would write them down and call them innovative. I told myself it wasn't personal. That Preston was just trying to mentor someone new. That I was being too sensitive. But over the months, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Kyle was being positioned as the future, and I was being quietly phased out. My client accounts started getting reassigned. My input in meetings was no longer requested. And now, staring at the schedule change, I understood what the endgame had always been. They wanted me gone so Kyle could take my place. Clean. Simple. No confrontation required. I spent that evening documenting everything I could think of. I pulled up old emails showing my performance reviews, client feedback praising my work, and metrics proving I consistently hit or exceeded targets. I saved copies of the original schedule I had worked for 3 years, the one that had been agreed upon when I was hired and had never been an issue. I documented the new schedule Preston had sent, noting the date, the lack of explanation, and the impossibility of managing it alongside my responsibilities as a single parent. I created a timeline showing when Kyle had started, when the favoritism had begun, and when my role had started shrinking. I didn't know if I would need all of this, but I had learned, over years of working in environments where decisions were made behind closed doors, that the only thing that mattered when push came to shove was proof. And I was building a trail of it. The whispers around the office grew louder over the next few days. On Friday, I overheard a conversation between 2 colleagues in the break room. "They're bringing someone in to take over Beatrice's accounts," one of them said. "Preston told Cora it's happening next week." "Who?" "I don't know. Someone Kyle recommended, I think." I didn't react. I poured my coffee, stirred in sugar, and walked back to my desk like I hadn't heard a thing. But internally, I was cataloging every detail. Preston hadn't told me directly that I was being replaced. He hadn't informed me that my role was changing. He had just altered my schedule in a way that made it nearly impossible for me to continue and assumed I would quit before the replacement even arrived. It was a coward's move. And it was about to backfire spectacularly. Over the weekend, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight this loudly. I wasn't going to march into Preston's office on Monday and demand an explanation or threaten to go to HR. That would make me look emotional, difficult, someone who couldn't handle change. Instead, I was going to do something that would hurt Preston far more than any confrontation ever could. I was going to comply. Perfectly. I was going to show up for every single one of those new shifts, on time, prepared, and flawless. I was going to handle my accounts so well that when the replacement arrived and inevitably failed to meet the standards I had set, the contrast would be impossible to ignore. And I was going to let Preston's plan collapse under the weight of his own poor judgment. By Sunday night, I had rearranged my daughter's schedule, secured after-school care, and mentally prepared myself for what was about to be the most exhausting week of my professional life. But I was ready. And I was calm. Monday came. I showed up at 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes early for my new 2 to 11 shift. I logged into my system, reviewed my task list, and began working through my client accounts with the same efficiency I had always brought to the job. Preston walked past my desk around 3 p.m. He paused, clearly surprised to see me there, calm and focused. "Beatrice," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "You're adjusting to the new schedule, okay?" I looked up and smiled. "Yes, thank you. Everything's under control." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, and walked away. I went back to my work. And for the rest of that shift, I handled every task that came my way, customer calls, account updates, issue resolutions, without a single mistake. By the time I logged off at 11 p.m., I had closed more tickets than I usually did in a full day. The next morning, I saw the metrics report. My productivity hadn't dropped. It had increased. And I could feel, even from a distance, Preston starting to realize that his plan wasn't working the way he'd expected. Small victories started accumulating throughout the week. On Tuesday, a colleague named Omar stopped by my desk during his break. "I don't know how you're doing it," he said, shaking his head. "Everyone thought you'd be gone by now." I kept my expression neutral. "Why would I be gone?" He hesitated. "You know, the schedule change. Everyone figured." He trailed off. "That I'd quit." I finished for him. He nodded. I smiled. "I'm not going anywhere." By Wednesday, other people were noticing too. My manager from a different department, a woman named Elaine who had always respected my work, sent me a message, "Heard about your schedule. Let me know if you need support." The message was brief, but the implication was clear. People were watching, and they were starting to see what was happening. Preston's plan was becoming visible, and visibility was the last thing he wanted. Thursday afternoon, I noticed something strange. HR hadn't sent out any onboarding emails. There were no new hire announcements. No calendar invites for training sessions. If someone was supposed to be starting soon to replace me, there was no evidence of it in the usual channels. I checked the schedule board in the break room. My name was still listed as the primary coordinator for my client accounts. No one else had been added. I felt a small, cold smile pull at the corner of my mouth. Either the replacement wasn't as lined up as Preston had implied, or something had gone wrong with the hiring process. Either way, the timeline he had planned was already starting to crack. And I was going to be there, steady and professional, when it shattered completely. Friday came. Preston seemed smug during the morning team meeting, the one I attended remotely since my shift didn't start until 2 p.m. He talked about exciting changes coming to the team and how new talent was going to help Redstone reach the next level. He didn't mention me. He didn't acknowledge the schedule change or the disruption it had caused. He just smiled, confident and in control, like everything was going exactly according to plan. I watched through the video call, my face calm, my hands folded in my lap. And I thought about what was coming. Because I had a feeling, one I couldn't quite explain but trusted completely, that Preston's confidence was about to become his biggest liability. I logged off the call. I showed up for my shift. And I waited. Monday morning of the following week, chaos erupted. I wasn't there to see it happen. My shift didn't start until 2 p.m., but the messages started flooding in around 9:30 a.m. Simone texted me. The replacement didn't show up. Preston is losing it. Omar sent a similar message. No one's here to cover your accounts. Clients are calling and no one knows what to do. I read the messages calmly, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and felt a wave of quiet satisfaction wash over me. The replacement, whoever they were supposed to be, had failed to appear for their first shift. No call. No email. No explanation. Just absence. And now, with me working the late shift and unavailable during the morning hours, there was a massive gap in coverage that Preston had created entirely on his own. I finished my coffee. I got ready for my shift. And I showed up at 1:45 p.m., exactly as scheduled, to an office that was barely holding itself together. When I walked in, the tension was immediate. Phones were ringing unanswered. Colleagues were scrambling between tasks, trying to cover accounts they didn't fully understand. And Preston was standing in the middle of the floor, his face flushed, talking rapidly on his phone to someone who was clearly not giving him the answers he wanted. I sat down at my desk, logged into my system, and began working through the backlog of messages and tickets that had piled up during the morning. Within an hour, I had cleared half of them. Within 2 hours, I had the workflow back under control. Clients who had been frustrated and confused that morning were now receiving prompt, professional responses. And as I worked, I could feel eyes on me. Colleagues watching. Management noticing. Preston realizing slowly and painfully that the person he had tried to push out was the only thing keeping his department from collapsing. Preston's scrambling became more obvious as the afternoon wore on. He pulled Omar aside and asked him to handle some of my client accounts. Omar, who had no experience with those accounts, struggled immediately. Preston then tried to delegate tasks to another team member, who politely reminded him that they were already at capacity. By 6 p.m., Preston was making calls to HR, his voice tight with frustration. I caught fragments of the conversation as I worked. I was told they would start today. No, I don't have another option lined up. We can't operate like this. I kept my head down, my face neutral, my work flawless. And I let him spiral. Because this panic, this realization that he had built a plan on assumptions that turned out to be wrong, was exactly what I had been waiting for. By Tuesday morning, HR was involved. I wasn't there for the early meetings, but the messages kept coming. Simone, HR is asking why there's no coverage plan. Omar, Preston got called into a closed-door meeting with Elaine. When I arrived for my shift at 2 p.m., the atmosphere had shifted. The chaos was still there, but now it was tinged with something else. Accountability. People were starting to ask questions. Why had Preston changed my schedule without a transition plan? Why had he assumed a replacement would be ready when clearly they weren't? Why had he created a coverage gap that left clients waiting and the team scrambling? And as those questions circulated, the whispers that had started weeks ago, the ones about Preston wanting me gone, began to resurface. Only now, they weren't whispers. They were conversations. And they were being had in front of people who mattered. I pulled up my documentation that night and reviewed everything I had saved. The timeline was clear. The emails showing my strong performance were undeniable. The schedule change, implemented without consultation or justification, was documented. And now, the fallout from Preston's failed plan was visible to everyone in the company. I didn't need to do anything else. The evidence was already doing the work for me. All I had to do was continue showing up, continue performing, and continue being the calm, competent professional I had always been. The contrast between my behavior and Preston's panic would speak louder than anything I could say. Wednesday afternoon, an executive I had never spoken to directly, a senior director named Colin Pratt, stopped by my desk. "Beatrice, do you have a minute?" I looked up. Of course. He gestured toward a conference room. We walked in, and he closed the door. "I've been reviewing the situation with your schedule change," he said, his tone measured. "Can you walk me through what happened?" I did. Calmly. Factually. I explained the email I had received, the lack of prior discussion, the impact on my personal responsibilities, and the gap in coverage that had resulted when the replacement didn't show. Colin listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded. "Thank you for your professionalism through all of this. It hasn't gone unnoticed." He paused. "We're going to address this." I returned to my desk and continued working, but something had shifted. I could feel it in the air, in the way people looked at me, in the way Preston avoided making eye contact when he walked past. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't scrambling. I was calm, steady, smiling politely while the people who had tried to push me out were flailing, trying to explain decisions that didn't make sense and justify plans that had failed. And that calm, that unshakable professional composure, was more powerful than any argument I could have made. Because it proved, without me saying a word, that I was exactly what Redstone needed. And Preston's plan to replace me had been exactly what it looked like, favoritism masquerading as strategy. Thursday brought the reckoning. An all-hands meeting was called for Friday morning, one I would attend remotely since it fell outside my shift hours. The agenda was vague, scheduling policies and team structure. But everyone knew what it was really about. The subject came up during my shift that evening. Simone stopped by my desk. "Preston's in trouble," she said quietly. "Elaine's been asking questions. Colin's been reviewing emails. People are talking about how the schedule change was never justified and how there was no backup plan." I nodded but didn't respond. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to add fuel to the fire. The facts were doing that on their own. And tomorrow, in front of the entire team, those facts were going to be laid out in a way that Preston couldn't talk his way around. The Friday meeting started at 10 a.m. I logged in from home, my camera on, my face calm. Colin led the meeting. He started by addressing recent concerns about scheduling changes and team coverage. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He asked Preston to explain publicly the rationale behind changing my schedule. Preston stammered. He talked about operational needs and strategic restructuring and aligning resources. But when Colin asked for specifics, what operational needs, what restructuring plan, what resources, Preston couldn't answer. Because there weren't any. The decision had been based on favoritism, not strategy. And now, in front of the entire team, that was becoming undeniable. HR was asked to weigh in. They confirmed that no formal process had been followed. No consultation. No documentation. Just a unilateral decision that had created a coverage crisis. The room, virtual and physical, went quiet. Then colleagues started speaking up. Omar mentioned how the lack of coverage had impacted client relationships. Simone pointed out that my performance hadn't dropped despite the disruption. Elaine, my former manager, noted that I had consistently been one of the highest performing coordinators and that destabilizing my role had destabilized the entire team. And through it all, I sat quietly, watching Preston's credibility crumble in real time. He tried to recover. He tried to reframe the decision as a misunderstanding. But the damage was done. The evidence was clear. And the respect that had once insulated him from scrutiny was gone. When the meeting ended, Colin announced that scheduling policies would be revised, that changes would require HR approval and employee consultation, and that my original schedule would be reinstated effective immediately. Preston's face was pale. And I felt, for the first time in weeks, like I could breathe. By the following Monday, the new normal had settled in. I was back on my original schedule. My client accounts were fully restored. And Preston was noticeably quieter. His interactions with me were brief and formal. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't try to justify what had happened. He just existed, diminished, his authority visibly weakened. Colleagues treated me differently now. Not with pity, but with respect. They had watched me handle an impossible situation with grace, and they had seen the people who tried to push me out fail spectacularly. Kyle, the replacement who was supposed to take my role, was reassigned to a different team. Quietly. Without fanfare. And I remained exactly where I had always been, competent, reliable, and now untouchable. At the end of that first week back on my original schedule, I left the office at 5 p.m., walked to my car, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. I had won. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I hadn't quit. I hadn't given Preston the easy out he wanted. I had shown up, done my job flawlessly, and let his poorly planned scheme collapse under its own weight. And in doing so, I had proven something I had always known but had never been forced to demonstrate so clearly. My value wasn't defined by the people who tried to diminish it. It was defined by the work I did, the professionalism I maintained, and the quiet strength I brought to every situation. I started the car and drove home, victorious in a way that didn't need applause. Just peace. 3 weeks later, life at Redstone had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. My schedule was stable. My workload was manageable. And Preston had learned a lesson he wouldn't forget. I thought about that email sometimes. The one that had landed in my inbox with its curt message and its unspoken threat. And I thought about the choice I had made in that moment. Not to quit, not to fight loudly, but to comply so perfectly, so professionally, that the plan designed to push me out became the very thing that exposed the people behind it. That's the lesson I carried forward. When someone tries to manipulate you into quitting, the most powerful response isn't anger. It's calm, strategic resistance. Show up. Do the work. Let their assumptions crumble. And when the chaos they created finally catches up to them, you'll be standing exactly where you've always been. Steady, professional, and untouchable. Intelligence and timing beat manipulation every single time.